barnstorming talk, dancing cats, rapping cats, mobile toilets and mobile offices, gritty, down-to-earth experiences, real-life successes negotiated in the workplaces, and you think, my God, this conference is fantastic. Contrast it with sitting on the platform. You go up there and you think, oh, full of that. So, but it went from bad to worse. We started off, and I thought, well, yeah, all right, this is a my topic, it'll be all right. But then, bit after bit, I was coming like, and then something else, and then you asked a lot of questions that cover the main source of my speech. So, it's not as though I can read it, terrible mass of poison, but this is out the window. It's just going to be on the hoof, and I'm really interested in what I've got to say. I have no idea what I've got to say, but I'm interested in what it might be like. And I'll start off with, I've got a 2-year-old son, Blaze, who's Joad's son, Oscar, named the evil Dr. Blaze. And he wakes up every morning at 4 o'clock, like a clock, and he's my alarm clock. So this morning he didn't wake up at 4 o'clock, and at 5:30 I jumped out of bed with the words, oh shit. I had to run down the road, get on the train at 10 to 6 and get to this conference. So unwashed, unprepared, and without PowerPoint, I'm here now. So there's no PowerPoint, my speech has been stolen, and I'm slightly unsettled because I'm normally the talking northerner. Geographically, I'm a southerner these days. Anyway, normally, what I'm asked to do at these conferences, what I'm asked to do is give you a potted history of what's wrong with the situation and how do we put it right. Today I've not been asked to do that, but I can't actually resist doing it anyway, so in these short time I'm going to try and do a 1-minute potted history of what's wrong with the current system and how we put it right. So basically, here goes. The government's bad, murderous, lying, and it's populated by posh classes and breeds who think that the search should keep in their place, and that's us. And they know that the problem with work is not red tape, it's too many bloody bandages, but they don't care about that, because it's not those that die as a result of work hazards, it's us that die as a result of work hazards. Instead, they propagate lies about burdens on business and compensation culture, which have no basis in fact. They're not idiots, they're not of our class though. They know that they don't die because of work hazards, they live the high life because we die from work hazards. The Health and Safety Executive is also a casualty. It's being slashed, handcuffed and hijacked by the government. Its leadership has capitulated and it's now in a form of collaboration with the government in cutting its own throat. HSE's strategy is don't regulate, don't inspect, and parent government prejudice and lies. It's the longest suicide note in history. It doesn't even count the bodies anymore. It's formalised that in the RIDOR changes, where you can pass out with being gassed at work and it's not reportable. You can have silicosis, it's no longer reportable. And so it continues like that. It doesn't want to know the problem. And if you don't count the bodies don't count. We're the answer. An injury to one is an injury to all. An injury to one is a cause for all. A cause for all of us. We fight for safety, we organise for safety, we train for safety, we act for safety. We are health and safety in the flesh. And we need to get organised, we need to get active, and we need to get them in whatever form they present themselves as employers, as governments, as people who are not fighting on our side. And finally, I normally say, life hazards. So that's it. But this isn't a normal day. I was asked to talk about the We Love Red Tape campaign and what I think should happen to the Health and Safety Executive and health and safety in this country. In the absence of a PowerPoint display, I could offer interpretive dance or some other thing to entertain you, but I still think I can possibly compete with those cats, so I'll just stand here and spiel. So what I want to tell you about today is HSE and its current Chief Executive, the lame-looking Chief Executive, Geoffrey Podger, who's due to leave in the autumn. The government would want to change the collar on a 3-legged dog. It don't want change, it wants it to be exactly the same. It wants a broken system to remain broken because that suits its interests. I believe we need a watchdog which not only has a full complement of legs, it has a bark and a bite, and I'm becoming aware now that we're getting a bit of a catty-doggy theme in this thing, so I'm trying. So it is with some embarrassment I put myself forward as Citizen Sane. I'm the guy that appears in these occasionally with the enormous bulbous nose. And what I'm about is looking at demanding the sort of health and safety executive we deserve, not complaining about the sort of health and safety executive we've got. The health and safety executive may have lost its mojo, but we haven't. We're still mojo-tastic, and we've got to think positively and creatively about what we want and what we are going to demand and what we are going to get. HSE's not always been the way it is now. Back in the 1920s, the first chief medical inspector of factories, Thomas Legge, resigned on principle because the government failed to enforce or refused to introduce the International Labour Organisation's White Leg Convention. He was also instrumental in ensuring that workers' compensation laws were changed so that victims of occupational diseases got compensation. Now, can you possibly, in your wildest dreams, imagine the health and safety executive operating as a friend of workers like that? Can you imagine someone like Geoffrey Podger resigning on principle because he's being kicked by the government and bashed around by the government? Can you imagine the health and safety executive coming out and saying, well, hang on a minute, these people are getting sick. Not only do they need justice from the health and safety executive, they need compensation because they're being hurt, harmed and disadvantaged as a result of abuses in the workplace. Now, as a consequence of HSE not doing these things, there's a contributory factor. We don't get prevention and we don't get compensation. Now, if you want to look at how bad the situation's got, for cancer, for most occupational cancers, the chances of getting compensation are less than 1 in 50. That's diseases that kill you. You know, this is a government who says there's a compensation culture that 49 out of 50 don't get compensation, even when they get a deadly cancer. For chronic obstructive airways disease, HSE says at least 4,000 people die every year. In 2011-12, only 59 got compensation. Stress is the end limit of this, and that's the disease of the modern era, stress, mental illness and the like. The government, the health and safety executive, the government recognises there are hundreds of thousands of people develop debilitating stress every year caused by their work. There's a 1 in 750 chance that those people in this compensation culture crazed world will get compensation at all. So that's the situation we're in with now. So we've got a situation whereby compensation claims payouts have fallen in 10 years from over 220,000 or around 220,000 10 years ago to under 90,000 last year. And yet we get government policy which they say is motivated by an absolute pressing need to deal with compensation culture. We've not got compensation culture, we've got a no compensation culture and a no justice culture, and we've got to get that message across and steal the argument back from the government, which is telling lies and it's damaging us as a result. So, the current leadership of HSE, led by Geoffrey Podger, didn't resign, they are resigned. They've given up on health and safety, they're sat there and taking government policy as fact and presenting it back to us as though it had some meaning. It hasn't got meaning unless it's just based on the political content of it, which is all about damaging workers and all about favouring their friends and their class. Still, for Geoffrey Podger, who's leaving shortly, I'm sure the £192,000 salary he gets is some sort of consolation. So, now next to it, so why do I want the job? £192,000. It's not as Mrs. Merton said about to Debbie McGee. So, why Debbie? What first attracted you to the multi-millionaire magician called Alex? No, I'm not in it for the money, which is just as well because I won't get an interview. I want to see a health and safety executive that isn't a gruesome reflection of government policy. The whole premise of what it does is based on workers being greedy, grasping, compensation obsessed and feckless. That's how their systems work, and that's clearly demonstrated in the contempt for workers in Phil and Scott's presentations today. Instead, I want to create, in our minds and in reality, an HSE version 2. I want to see an HSE that champions workers and fights for justice. I want to see an HSE that advocates and presses for the criminals that damages at work to be jailed. I want to see an HSE that advocates for justice for workers and for compensation for workers. I want to see an HSE that stands up against the government when it's undermining health and safety, and that stands up for workers when we're being damaged by health and safety, instead of sitting quietly while there's a bonfire of regulations and excusing the government's policy and the strangulation of health and safety and the strangulation of the regulator. How bad it is can be demonstrated just in the sums, and not just the compensation sums, but in the actual money that HSE gets. In 2009-10, the last year of the Labour government, and it was no bed of roses under Labour until Callaghan was the worst chair of the Health and Safety Executive that there's ever been, and he was from a trade union background. But in 2009-10, the last year of the Labour government, the government gave HSE £239 million as its budget. Next year, or this year, 2013-14, HSE gets £165 million. Fee for fault and things like that don't make up that shortfall. What we've got is, I don't know, do this on 40% drop in 10 years, at a time when the workforce has grown considerably. So we've got less policing and a less interested police force. I want HSE to just adopt outlines. Instead of saying, you know, it's all about bonkers conkers or living in a culture of total denial, I want it to actually stand up and say, the problem at work isn't too much red tape, it is too many bloody bandages. It doesn't stand up and say that. It's not the advocate for workers, it's not the voice of workers. And it needs to be that. So if you look at the extent of the problem, you can look at it, you know, sort of like, we'd estimate 50,000 people a year die as a result of work-related diseases, 1,000 die as a result of accidents, 30,000 even by HSE figures plus suffer major injuries, and that's not minor things, that's scalping and things like that, although HSE and Sardine figures should make that seem a little better shortly. It's 20 times the number of people that die in road accidents. It's the equivalent of 2 airliners crashing every week, and yet it's not a major public priority. You know, an airline has a slight fire on it at an airport in the last week or two, it's frontline praise and head of the news. We have 2 of those every week that occur to us, and we never get in the news at all. HSE has got to give the right answers to the right questions, rather than government answers to the wrong questions. But at the moment, HSE is a regulator that's averse to regulating. It's excluded 37 sectors explicitly on government instruction from inspection, proactive, preventive inspections, including plastics, health service and agriculture, all enormously safe sectors. Only 5% of major injuries even get investigated now, so in 95% of cases you can lose that leg or you can be scalped, and HSE won't even turn out to have a look. So there's no chance of justice there, and there's no chance of prevention, and there's no chance of a signal to employers that something needs to be done. They can get away with it with impunity. HSE is a regulator with a self-imposed blindfold when it comes to work-related health problems. Podger, the current leader of the Health and Safety Executive, my predecessor, has overseen without peep. Honestly, I'll get a drink when I've got £192,000 a year. Podger has overseen without peep the almost certainly illegal dissolution of HSE's entire medical wing. It's down to 3 doctors and a handful of nurses, if they've recruited that extra doctor that they said they were going to get. This is not leadership, this is just capitulation. What we need, what we deserve, is someone who will stand up to the government and will stand up for workers. So basically I want to spell out how I'd operate Health and Safety Executive differently. How to do the job differently. Firstly, I'd not turn a blind eye. We have to arrest HSE's call from inadequacy, which it is now, to irrelevance, which it seems to be making a helter-skelter bid to achieve. For starters, all major injuries and all serious occupational diseases would be investigated. There would also be a presumption that when these happen in a workplace, that somebody would be prosecuted. It doesn't happen by chance, it happens by neglect and a lack of management control over the workplaces. They control their finances so that they get their wage packets and bonuses, yet they don't seem to be able to control the conditions so that workers can actually be protected when they're in there. They can't have it both ways. Secondly, I produce an honest argument on burdens. For each pound spent, we'll deliver several pounds in savings to society as a whole. It's a fact, it's proven time and time again by studies. So I've doubled HSE's budget because it's good economics. Fatalities cost about, workplace fatalities cost about £1 million each by the government's calculations. Occupational cancers cost about £3 million each by the government calculation. So save 100 lives a year by increasing enforcement and putting better pressure on employments to improve conditions, and you've offset the entire Health and Safety Executive budget. You're getting the Health and Safety Executive for free. You're also having to save 100 lives along the way, you know, which has a sort of like a minor fringe benefit. Thirdly, I'm not compromising safety. There are departments across government that support enterprise. It's an industry within government which is incredibly well financed. The only bulwark we have against health and safety abuses is the Health and Safety Executive, and yet it's put in the first line of all its sentences that it's concerned about burdens, that it's concerned about health and safety, it's about sensible regulation and the rest. It's not, it's about capitulation and giving into the government agenda about burdens and red tape. We can't actually accept that, and we won't accept that. When it comes to health and safety, it's all we've got, and it's got to be willing to bite the hand that started. It can't do its job on this budget, it can't do its job under these constraints. It should kill the policies that kill, rather than just explain and excuse them. It says nothing as progressive damage is done by the government to the system that's supposed to protect us. I'd also have honest consultations. HSE's consultations at the moment start with a government statement of political policy, like health and safety regulation is a problem, we need to reduce it, and then phase a question within that framework. It's not an honest question, and it's the wrong question, and you can only get the wrong answer when you ask the wrong question. Health and safety policy is fashioned on the basis of government prejudice at the moment, not evidence. And it's basically fashioned by the lunatic fringes of the business community. And that's what the government sees as its constituency, and it's who it's influenced by, not the workers who are supposed to be protected by health and safety abuses. Fourthly, I prioritise prevention. HSE is the ultimate practitioner at the moment of the inverse prevention law. If it doesn't work, it's more likely to do it. If it does work, it's not going to touch it with a barge pole, like regulation enforcement and things like that. So we get leaflets, we don't get enforcement, we get referred to the website. Well, we don't want a wiki HSE, we want a real HSE that turns up in our workplaces and polices the thing. We're not allowed, it was mentioned by Scott, about making complaints to HSE. Oh, no, you're not allowed to make complaints anymore. Oh, well, as you would have it. We've now changed on to a system where you're allowed to raise concerns about health and safety. Curiously, the HSE website allows you to complain about the health and safety executive. It allows you to complain about regulation, and it allows you to complain about people being overzealous in implementing health and safety legislation. But you can only, you can't complain about employers, you can only raise concerns about. This is passive language crap. It's basically relegating the fact that our protection should come first. It's making HSE's problem about regulation instead of HSE's problem about protecting us with regulation. And after all, as far as HSE is concerned now, we don't want to be impolite when it comes to life and limbs and things like that, but you can be rude as you like when it comes to stuff like saying that regulations are problem. This is how I do prevention. Well, firstly, I make it easy for employers to do the right thing. I'd set up a Bright Ideas unit, which would encourage innovative, preventive, precautionary approaches. It has units within it like toxic use reduction. Now, this is brain science, but why is that not existing already within Health and Safety Executive? It don't cost any money to say you do these things, you just do it. It can be routine, it can be what you do as your bread and butter. You know? The other advantage of actually doing things like this, preventive approaches, is it actually promotes innovation. And innovation makes money for business. It's new products, new jobs, and it's good for us all round, and it also saves lives. You know, that's a good thing. It's been proven absolutely. When they introduced cotton regulations in the United States, and it required employers to retool absolutely, the businesses suddenly found out that their profits went through the roof. They could produce better, the workplaces were better, there were new machines, and everything worked really well. It never occurs to the government here, of course, that that would work here. Of course it would. That's what happens when you retool. That's what happens when you have a better, more up-to-date production process. So there's benefits all around. You know, it's a little spin-off, we don't get sick. Fifthly, I meant protecting health a priority. Remember, work-related ill health causes at least 100 times more people than injuries, although you don't know that from the Health and Safety Executive. And as was indicated by both Scott and Phil, the diseases of the modern workplace aren't the old ones, but they're being complemented and probably outweighed now by heart disease, suicide and stroke, the disease in the modern era. And you know, you'll find so much so that we have an explicit suicide page on our website. It's just one of the big issues that come up and bite us all the time. So I'd stop the pretense that workplace health regulation is a problem and it's too hard to sort out. I'd put the H back in Health and Safety Executive. Sixth, and there's only 3 more left, you'll be pleased to hear. Sixth, I'd make health and safety answerable to the workers. HSE's board, as been mentioned before, is dominated by employer reps, either officially or unofficially. 7 out of 9 are the non-executive directors, are retired or semi-retired top industry folks, who have a nice little earner. They get 16 grand for 30 meetings a year. Yeah. It's ka-ching when you come to the health and safety executive, as long as you're in the high positions. £192 to be chief executive, £1,000 a day, near enough to be on the board. Now, there are problems with the board structure now that are illustrated by the 2 most recent appointments. George Breakin is the public interest representative on the HSE board. Now, 2 people in this room applied for that job, me and Louise there, and didn't even get an interview. I'm told our applications were the strongest ones that went in, but we were blackballed by the Department of Work and Pensions rep on the platform. Instead, the public interest rep, the person that represents injured workers, or that represents occupational disease groups, families against corporate killers, is supposed to be our collective grassroots voice, is a retired chief executive of a health authority. what knowledge, what contact with that constituency he's got. And remember that in no time in history, to my knowledge, has a public interest representative on the HSE board ever consulted the public. You know, it's all done without them. Apparently they know what we feel like. NHS chief executive knows what it's like in your workplace and my workplace. They know what we're feeling, so they don't have to bother to ask. But the other one, which is even more grievous, is the new Employer Act that's been brought in, actually on the explicit say-so of David Cameron. His name's John Morgan. Now, you may have heard of the disaster at BP Alaska, where it was the most heralded, nastiest occupational crime of its time. Dangerous carcinogens were pumped down wells at BP in Alaska, and the person at the head of BP Alaska at the time, when it was investigated by the FBI, given record criminal penalties, record civil penalties, and BP was put on 5 years probation because of the magnitude of this crime, was one John C. Morgan. He was put through on the nod from David Cameron onto the board of the HSE board, because that's exactly the sort of people they want controlling our health and safety. People who've been done for corporate crimes on the FBI hit list, and that's the sort of people they want, not me and Louise, you know, because we're coming up starts from the north. So that's the sort of person we've got. And I asked the HSE, you know, bearing in mind, I handed them on the papers about the court case and the press releases from the EPI and the FBI. I said, do you think you want to really reconsider this job or rescind your job because you've done this? And they wrote back after 3 exchanges of freedom of information things where they initially refused to give me information. I said, it's not relevant. I said, not relevant. In fact, it's being studied by the FBI. So that's what we got. So, another thing you might actually say is, on the Health and Safety Executive at the moment, there's a consumer rep, a consumer interest. So shoppers have got a seat on the Health and Safety Executive board. Why don't we have a ring-fence seat for occupational disease victims? Why don't we have a ring-fence seat for FAC? Why are all the seats ring-fenced for FAC when it comes to that? That's the situation we should be, where there's more grassroots, where people are actually have got something invested in this or something to say, not something that people have got something invested in the companies that are doing the harm. I'd also introduce a whistleblowers hotline, because at the moment there's no such thing. It's almost impossible to find a telephone number for a HSE, let alone ring them up. At the moment, Health and Safety Executive doesn't allow you to make anonymous complaints. Now, if it's good enough for Dobber-Dealer and it's good enough for Crime Stoppers, it should be good enough for HSE. We should be able to ring up and grass someone up who's doing the wrong things, but we're not allowed to do that at the moment. I'd also give HSE a reality check. Work's changed, but HSE hasn't kept up, as Phil pointed out so compellingly. Male manufacturing jobs have been destroyed by successive governments, and what we're left with now is a new UK PLC, which has more women workers, more migrant workers, more temporary workers, more agency workers. It's been outsourced, it's been sold off, and now we're in a situation where HSE has no way of dealing with or engaging with that community. Risks have been subcontracted, outsourced and shunted onto the night shift and HSE naturally on the works office hours. We need ways to access workers at different, and that doesn't necessarily mean being in the workplace. It could mean being in the community, through a community centre, through a mosque, through other centres, through other local centres, maybe through a pub, and having meetings in all these settings with wide groups of workers. We need HSE to realise that the problems that we see, it should see, but it doesn't at the moment. You know, the major problems that loom for us at the moment are insecurity, as Phil said, work intensification, low wages, because if you're on a low wage you can't afford to lose your job and you can't afford to speak out, blacklisting, behavioural safety, oppressive monitoring, as Phil said, fatigue, sickness monitoring, all these ways that the controllers, they're always employs exercise control at the expense of safety. HSE has nothing to say on any of these issues and doesn't have a clue on them. It has to have if it's going to have relevance to workers in the modern era. Finally, I give power to the workers. First, really don't. There you go. HSE can't be anywhere, but workers by design are everywhere. They're in every workplace. It just stands for the way they're going with new management techniques. They may not be in every workplace, but robots maybe. But there's 150,000 safety reps out there who can do a job. You know, if there's only 1,000 or so factory inspectors, we outnumber them quite a lot, and so they should take advantage of that. That means by, you know, we had a worker safety advisor model, which was an absolute roaring success. HSE admitted it, and then it dropped it dead. We have HSE admitting that the union effect is a very real thing, and it dramatically improves workplace health and safety standards, yet reps on the ground get no help at all and no support. And so what we would have in the my model is a new HSE version 2.0. Not only would it support reps, it would give them access to a treasure chest, which would be a box of money which would allow finance innovative, preventive training and development work, mapping participatory research, cross-community work, cross-sectoral work with trades councils, things like that. All the sort of stuff we do on the ground that needs more support will be better when it's properly resourced, working with hazard centres and like people like you. Conclusion, we don't want to fix the HSE, we want to reinvent it. My candidacy for the job, we're not going to get, is about ambition and expectations. We've got to get the message out there that we're not happy with what we've got and we want better and we deserve better. We need to destroy the red tape myth, which means taking it public. We need to destroy the compensation culture myth. And so if anyone says it to you anymore, if it comes in your paper, if it appears in your paper, if you sit on the news, get through to them and tell them that this is bolts and we've got the statistics there because Rory made them up on a stage when we saw them. I need you to go back to your unions and to endorse my candidacy for this post. Not because I want to be the leader of the Health and Safety Executive, but I don't want their choice to be the leader of the Health and Safety Executive. We've got to say what we want and why we want it. So please go back to your unions and say no more three-legged, no new collar on a three-legged dog. Have faith in yourselves, because in truth, the Health and Safety Executive isn't the answer to the problem. It can be a contributor to make our jobs easier. When push comes to shove, health and safety will always be in our own hands. It's down to us to organise and to act to get safety at work, and there was great examples from Scott of that actually happening. You've got to remember that it is better to put your neck on the line than let your employer put your neck on the block. I know it's hard to be a union rep, and I know that there are many times when you feel anxious about sticking your head above the parapet, but the choice is no choice. You know, we've got to improve workplace for ourselves or not. And finally, I'd say, buy hazards.